here at First Pres as part of the Urban Renewal Center for a topic that is not only important, but is also urgent. And it's a timely one, and we need to be engaged in that. And we're not going to get anywhere in this discussion if we don't ask for the involvement of the Holy Spirit. For 400 years, we've tried to do this without God. We got to bring Him into the game. And so, what I'd love to do is I'd love to ask you to join me in prayer, and then we'll begin with our program this evening. So, Lord God and Heavenly Father, you and you alone are in charge of this universe. And we humbly come before you today asking that you would intervene, that your Holy Spirit would transform our minds and renew them to the way that you would have us think and act. And we ask that the conversation tonight would be infused by you and you alone, and that as we try to tackle an issue that has truly been outside of the possibilities, that we find possibilities that haven't been there before. And we know, Lord, that you desire that we would love one another, and this is the way that we can show that. So we're thankful for that you've called us here tonight. We ask that you would bless those that speak. We ask that you would protect us as we travel to and from. And Lord, above all, we ask that we would give you the honor and the glory. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen. So, a couple of housekeeping things for us. On your table, you'll see pieces of paper and pens. We're going to do a Q&A part on this, but there will be no open mic. You'll need to write your questions out. We'll have folks come around to grab those questions, and they will then be presented to our panelists. We're going to begin the program. One of the things that we've noticed as we've gone through this topic is that there is an enormous amount of information that not everyone is aware of. So we've produced an 8-minute video, and that video is designed to level set this process so that we can all operate off of the same degree of facts that are available. We'll then have a panelist come up here. We'll have 3 experts in the field, as well as our very own Antipas that will present a brief overview in response to the film that you'll see. And then questions will be taken from the floor in the form of those pieces of paper that we would ask that you would write the questions on. This is being streamed, live streamed on the FPC Norfolk.org website as we speak. So if you have people who could not come, please let them know they can watch this live stream on that. The video that you will see will be available on the URC website, and it will be available beginning when it gets turned on here. We haven't put it out to public until we let you guys be the first to see that. And with that, would you please run tape?
Gentrification is a process of change whereby affluent residents move into a previously impoverished neighborhood, substantially raising property values, which often leads to a change in the character of the community by displacing longtime residents. Gentrification can create further racial disparities in homeownership and lead to more racially segregated neighborhoods. Gentrification is partly fueled by historic policies of racial exclusion, preventing African Americans and other minorities from owning property. Policies such as racial covenants, clauses written into property deeds that prohibited their sale to African Americans, and redlining, whereby the Federal Housing Authority, or FHA, effectively denied insured loans to minority applicants because of their race. In the 1930s and 1940s, the FHA primarily insured loans only to white applicants in white neighborhoods, advising against any incompatible racial groups from living in the same communities. The FHA spurred suburbanization mostly by insuring loans only for the homes in suburban areas, where white-only neighborhoods were being built, while routinely denying insuring loans to blacks who lived in inner-city minority neighborhoods. At the end of World War II, the VA guaranteed home loans to returning white GIs, promising no money down and low interest rates. At the same time, most Black veterans were denied VA loans due to redlining policies that prohibited banks from lending to African Americans. While the 1930s and 1940s offered a chance for white homeowners to own property and accumulate wealth, many Black Americans were forced into rent-dependent housing, first in inner-city slums with inflated rental rates specifically targeting African Americans, and then into public housing, which concentrated poverty and furthered segregated neighborhoods. This has created a lasting national wealth gap between Blacks and whites, with white median wealth being 12 times higher than Black median wealth. Owing to the distinction that 2/3 of all wealth is tied to home equity value. In Norfolk, Virginia, many of the national segregationist policies played out on the neighborhood level in Ghent and East Ghent, the section bordered by Colonial Avenue, Olney Road, Granby Street, and 21st Street. Originally an affluent white suburb, Ghent grew to prominence in the early 20th century as new trolley cars helped ferry whites from downtown Norfolk into the white-only suburbs of Ocean View, Larchmont, Edgewater, and Ghent. World War II then saw much of Ghent's historic single-family homes converted into segregated wartime housing for the naval yards. After World War II, Ghent grew increasingly run down as many of Ghent's white residents moved out to the racially controlled suburbs in Virginia Beach and Chesapeake, as well as to Larchmont and Edgewater, all made possible by specially insured loans from the VA. Black veterans returning to Norfolk, who were denied VA loans and prohibited from buying property in white neighborhoods, moved into crowded slums in downtown Norfolk, Atlantic City, North Ghent, West Ghent, East Ghent, and Ghent proper. As the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority kicked off its urban renewal programs in 1949, slum housing started to come down and public housing for African Americans was built in its place in Tidewater Park, Young Park, and Calvert Square. In that process, federal governmental policy required that all public housing for Blacks be built in already Black majority neighborhoods, and already economically struggling neighborhoods became even poorer. When Virginia was faced with school integration in 1959, the slums continued to come down, but public housing was no longer being built. Instead, many demolished homes were paved over with industrial parks and schools to act as buffer zones, specifically designed to keep neighborhoods segregated. Atlantic City, now Fort Norfolk, saw its growing racially integrated neighborhoods demolished in order to build factories to keep Black neighborhoods from mixing with white neighborhoods. And North Ghent was redeveloped as a majority white neighborhood in order to keep Morey High School and Blair Middle School majority white schools. With a lack of new public housing projects and acts of violence carried out against Black families who tried to move into white neighborhoods, housing disparities became even more dramatic as Black poverty was further concentrated in increasingly smaller slums and limited public housing options. In the 1960s, when the NRHA declared Ghent a conservation zone, the FHA began issuing federally insured loans almost exclusively available only to white buyers. Many Black families ineligible for FHA insured loans were forced out of Ghent as white families began to buy up deteriorated houses, renovate the neighborhood, and substantially raise property values. Gentrification became gentrification, earning Norfolk the All-American City Award from Look magazine. Many of Ghent's Black residents moved to East Ghent, a majority Black neighborhood where more than half of its 1,000 homes were declared substandard. By the 1970s, as part of its urban renewal program, the NRHA annexed the entirety of East Ghent and quickly demolished nearly every building. The NRHA promised the Black community They would build low-income housing in its place and that the residents could come back once the redevelopment project was finished. But instead, the NRHA, claiming federal funds for the project had dried up, resold East Ghent to private developers who built expensive homes. With many Black residents unable to return to East Ghent, a substantial number left Norfolk. The lasting effect of discriminatory housing policies can still be seen in Norfolk today. With few opportunities to own property in Norfolk, many Black residents were forced into public housing. While Norfolk is a minority city, nearly half Black and half white, the legacy of segregated housing has contributed to a growing wealth gap where over half of all those living below the poverty line are Black. Eviction rates among the highest in our nation are evidence of a pronounced rental instability, disproportionately impacting African Americans and other minorities. And in East Ghent, where urban renewal took place, the median income is 7 times higher than in Tidewater, where public housing was built, where many of Norfolk's schools remain de facto segregated, and where the neighborhood is in the top 10 for incarceration rates in the country. Norfolk's history of segregation has cemented a lack of community trust from failed redevelopment programs in the past. And on the verge of Norfolk's changing tides, our time, our land, and our options are running out.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening. It is such an extraordinary opportunity to have this conversation with you, but also to be back in Norfolk. And also, will you give yourselves a great big round of applause? Look at this class tonight. That was a very informative video. Hopefully you connected with parts of it, maybe some parts that you didn't know before tonight. We can get our conversation going. You know, Pastor Jim, this is Pastor Jim Wood. Can we give Pastor Jim Wood a round of applause? First of all, I want to thank you for having this conversation. It's such a privilege that to be together with you and other pastors and community leaders and elected officials that are here tonight. If you're an elected official, would you please stand so we can acknowledge you? Also, we have the Honorable Brenda Allen. Is she here tonight? I think she, yes, thank you for being here tonight. We have the Chief Police of Norfolk Police Department here tonight. Chief Boone, thank you for being here tonight. This is a very interesting conversation, and I appreciate the video going back to the early 1900s, leading up to the mid-1900s, because a little sentimental, because my grandfather fought in World War II, and he's from a little town called Warm Springs, Georgia, with a little white house. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, her mom, so my maternal great-grandmom, was considered in the African-American community of Greenville, Georgia, to be a wealthy person. I'll tell you why. Because she was an entrepreneur. She wasn't really wealthy, but she was an entrepreneur. She sold moonshine. I knew there was something in your life that made you think as a Presbyterian. She sold moonshine. It was near the railroad those days where the African-American men worked on the railroad tracks. And so she decided to make her house a little hotel. And she built it herself. Because she put my great-grandfather out because she said he was lazy. And so she decided to build her own little hotel in her house. And she was a midwife, so she was an entrepreneur. So, but she couldn't have a bank account. So she would put the money under her bed. And of course, several times her house burned down and she had to start all over again. But my grandfather, when he came out of the war, and my grandmother and he got married, And they had 5 children, and he needed somewhere for them to live. And as the video talked about, he was not able to access the money that veterans could get in those days, and also there was a certain side of town that he could live in. So he had to go to my grandmother for a loan, and my grandmother helped him build a house, and of course her house burned down and didn't help her well.
It's probably those stills that cause those houses to burn down.
But the point is that I'm making is that my family has been intricately a part of the process of being the beneficiaries of a system that structurally marginalized them so that they could not advance. And so when, post office was giving jobs to African Americans and teachers, my dad went to school, became a teacher. I went to HBCU, Payne College in Georgia. And so that's how my family rose to the middle class, because of governmental jobs. And I just said a lot there with a lot of implications. But I thought that I would pass it over to you to see what are your reactions after watching a video like this.
Yeah, thanks, Antipas. It's so good to be together again. You know how much I love you. The irony is not missing on me. Where you are, all of you who are gathered tonight, and thank you so many of you for being here. This is so exciting for us. We're actually in East Ghent. And I say that because when we did this, when we built this 10 years ago, we tried to have a plan to build it off of Colonial. Colonial is Ghent, and the restrictive zoning that came to gentrify Ghent forbade us from doing that. So we came to the back of the parking lot, which is East Ghent, and those zones were, the laws were liberalized in the sense to be able to build what we have as the townhomes and the homes back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. So you are literally seated over, as we built this building, you are seated over so many homes that we, in putting infrastructure, dug up and saw. So what you saw in that movie, I think, is overwhelmingly important for us to realize that this is our context. And our intent is not to in any way, throw shade on anyone or anything. If we did, our congregation, First Presbyterian, would be one of the first, and it is one of the first that needs to be in a pose and a posture of repentance for our life and how we've benefited from so much of what's happened and the disparities that have existed. So that sets for me the tone of where we are as a city. I love this city. I've been here 20 years, but this is my home. My kids went to school here, they went to public school here. We love this place. And yet we can't help but recognize the disparities that exist, primarily the segregation that exists in housing, and so many different ways. So having said that, and one of the things that really grabbed me in the national conversation is this generational wealth. So generational wealth for an average white family, meaning the money that's left when you die goes to another generation, is $148,000. For an African American family, it's less than 11. 2/3 of all generational wealth is in home equity. So my mom died in May. She was 1 month short of being 100. When my mom was 3 years ago, when my mom was at a place where she needed to be in skilled nursing, we sold her home for less than $40,000. She had a VA loan, an FHA loan. We sold her home, and it enabled her to get into a skilled nursing facility. That's because she qualified for that FHA loan. And had that not been her, that was her wealth. And then I look at this, that was by our federal policies forbade folks of color to qualify for these loans. It's astounding to me. And when we see this, we look at the wealth disparity, and very often we say, if we want people to become educated with wealth, well, no, if you look at the charts, the wealth disparities don't change much, whether of African Americans and whites, whether they have a high school diploma or they have an undergraduate degree or master's degrees. It's this accumulated wealth, this prohibition for people to be able to have
something that for us as whites has been so available, and not only available, but so critical to who we are, how we identify ourselves. It's horrifying to recognize that. And I think as we look at what happened here in Norfolk, we see this disparity that becomes even more exacerbated. I mean, it's astounding to me as we look at it. So, I think about so much of what happened, and we talk so much about what happened with the Norfolk 17, which were the first 17 African Americans that matriculated into the Norfolk public school system in 1959. The great battle, the great war that was waged to accomplish that. And I see that these segregated policies, and particularly the prohibition to own a home, in essence, de facto, de jure to start with, and then de facto, has kept us so separated, in fact, even more. And when we do these redevelopments, so very often, we become even more separated. And so, it's, we often say it's green spaces and white faces, right? When we do something. So how do we, as a people, as citizens of this great city, how do we look at that and try to understand? And I think if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. So that to me is so important. Many people don't realize. So Norfolk State, and my friend Dr. Keith Jones used to school me on this, and then I started researching myself. Norfolk State now sits, it's a beautiful campus, right? I was there on Monday, meeting with Dr. Perkins. It sits on a golf course, the Memorial Park golf course, that was an all-white golf course until the 40s. And it began to be, it was one of the first in Virginia, perhaps one of the first in the South, that allowed African Americans to play during the day on the golf course, to be part of it. Norfolk State was downtown Main Street. So we ended up having 35 acres deeded to build a beautiful HBCU, and then we surrounded it with public housing, and we segregate. It's astounding to me. And I'm not saying that all of the intentions. I'm not trying to get the intentions of people. I don't. That's not. But it's the result. It's where we end. And I think that's where our conversation hopefully will take us tonight.
Absolutely. I think that is what you said was profound. And if we don't have conscientization, this awareness of what's happening, the law of entropy will get us. Because law of entropy says that things are bent toward disorder. And that's what we see as it relates to race and racism that we once knew under slavery and Jim Crow, that we thought we'd overcome. And if we don't remain in conversation without intention, the law of entropy, social entropy, would get us back to where we were before. So how wonderful it is for the church and the community to welcome a conversation like this.
We're divided even. One of the great debates in Norfolk right now is whether we should have all those bike lanes, right? Are they helpful or are they not? Well, let me tell you, one of the reasons why those bike lanes are there is because those roads are so wide. And what happened was federal funding was taken to build those roads that wide to keep races segregated. And it's the absolute fact of how our city was framed in the midst of the 20th century. It's time for us to cross the street, right? I mean, it's time for us to have a conversation that engages.
Absolutely, because, and like you said, it's time for us to cross the street, because we still have invisible fences. When Chief Boone invited us to have flood patrol, to get out on the streets on Friday and Saturday nights, to be present in the city, to support the police, and also to help with mediating conflict with the community. I can't tell you how many pastors, many of whom were white pastors, who said that I can't believe that a mile from where I preach, that this was reality. Because there's an invisible fence. You can actually live in this city your whole life and not know what's happening on the other side of the street. And when you don't know, and then those folks who don't know are now in the boardroom making decisions, whether they're intending to cause what happens or not, It happens because they never cross the street.
Right.
And as long as you have one black guy as your friend, you don't need any more. I just thought of that. I feel that out there for Pastor Keith Jones.
He's my friend. I'm gonna stop. I know it's not stop. We have people who have much more wisdom and discernment than I do. So I want to thank you for leading us in conversation tonight. And I'm so excited about where this will take us. And again, I believe that the Lord has provided us with wonderful leadership within our city, within our elected officials, our judiciary, all of the folks that are here, and so many others that are in our administration, NRHA, all of those things. I believe that as our faith says, they're appointed by God. We as the citizens have a responsibility as well, and how we frame our questions and our lives, I think, is central to this conversation. So I hope that's what's going to happen tonight. And it's always good to see you.
Good to see you. We're delighted to have three distinct panelists. We had a fourth one, from the NRHA, and we got regrets from them today that John Conrad wished that he could be here, and but he has not gotten back into town, so they sent their regrets. But tonight we have Dr. John Finn, Associate Professor of Geography at Christopher Newport University. Would you please join me on stage? We have Ms. Brenda Andrews, who is the publisher and owner of the New Journal and Guide. And we have Dr. Robert Perkins, Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of Graduate Programs in the Department of Sociology at Norfolk State University. The way this will go, please have a seat, folks. Make yourself at home. Oh, that's a lot of people. That's a lot. So while you have already started asking questions by jotting down questions on the pieces of paper that are on your table, I want to invite you to continue to do that, or to do it if you have not started already. And we have Beth and Hunter here. We'll take those questions once you're ready for them. And they will, later on, they will ask the questions, and I will direct the questions on the stage. But to start, I've asked our panelists to give us perspective based on their expertise, experience, and also the context that has been set in our video. We're going to begin with Dr. Robert Perkins. From a sociological perspective, will you give us your perspective?
All right. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So, they went and gave Robert Perkins an open mic. 5 minutes. Like, they told me to talk about racial stuff. Okay. Well, I want to talk about structure and inequality. And that kind of set the stage for the rest of the dialogue. When you think about structure and inequality, different things come to mind. And when you think about inequality, different things come to mind, as well as they should, because we live in a big society with a lot of social ills. So there's one thing that all of these inequality issues have in common, and that's the word power. Let's repeat that together. Power. So the question is, who has the power? Because if you have the power, you have the ability to make change. Now, my argument has always been, everyone has some power. And in sociology, we argue that you have agency, meaning that you have power over yourself to control yourself. You have the freedom of thinking, you have the freedom of will, you have the freedom of choice, you have the freedom of speech, particularly here in America. So you have some degree of power. But for this particular issue, I want to talk about structural power. So when you think of structural power, the definition is the ability to make people do things even if they don't want to. I'll repeat that, because they went and gave me an open mic. The ability to make people do things, even if they don't want to. Now, individual power tells me that I can go home, and even though I have to say yes and amen to everything on the job, at least at home, I can do what I want. That's my safe haven. That's the place that I can control. But in society, it simply isn't so. So I want to do a quick exercise. I want everyone to close your eyes. Everyone, please close your eyes. Now, if I can see your eyes, you can't fool me on this, right? Now, imagine yourself locked in a cage. You're locked in a cage. You cannot get out of this cage. Everything that you want, everything that you desire is on the outside of this cage. Now imagine yourself reaching through or between the bars to grab all that good stuff that you want in life that's just a fingertip away, but you can't get it because you're what? Locked in a cage. Now open your eyes. That's not a good feeling, is it? And you know why you're locked in a cage? Because you don't have what? Power. So your escape is to go where? Home. At least at home, I have the right to make a decision. At least at home, I can feel safe. At least at home, it is my territory, my domain. And then all of a sudden, the city comes in. Hello? I told you they gave me an open mic.
Tell it.
All of a sudden, the city comes in and tells you what?
You got to go.
That is what? No longer your home. You have to what? Go. So that power, the only power that you thought you had has now been what? Taken away. And not only the power in your home, the power in the community. The community that you invested in, the community that you love, all your loved ones, your neighbors, your family, your friends, the memories, the holidays, the burying of your mother and your grandmother and your grandfather and grandfather. Everything now is being what? Taken away. So it's not just the lack of power that you have taken from me, you've also taken away what? My life. And now you're telling me to rebuild somewhere else. Now let's go back to that cage and then I'll sit down. That cage that you were locked in means something. Because cagers is actually an acronym that I created to explain inequality. And inequality is defined as the unequal distribution of valued resources. So C stands for class, A stands for age, G stands for gender, E stands for ethnicity, R stands for race, S stands for sex. So based on these, what we call social location, it determines out of the gate at your birth how much power you may have in this society. So for those of us that's lucky enough to be born into the higher pinnacle of it all, don't forget those that was unfortunate enough to be born on the other side. Power.
Ms. Brenda Andrews, we'd like to hear your perspective, your real lived perspective, and your wisdom of experience.
All right.
Your daddy's paper.
It's quite, it's humbling for me to be presenting on that topic, given that the founding publisher of the Journal and Guide, P.B. Young, is the man for whom Young Park is named. Mr. Young, back in the 1940s, along with some other people, specifically Richard Bowling, you may remember Bowling Park, and you in Norfolk were very, very disturbed and concerned about the living conditions of Black people in the 1930s and 40s. And we have in our archives, and we will turn 120 years of age in 2020. We have in our archives pictures of the slums in the 1920s and 30s that people of color, Black people, lived in at that time. And so Mr. Young and men and women who believed that people of color should live in decent and affordable housing were part of the movement across the country to bring public housing into being. And as I went through the archives in the Journaling Guide historical data today, I found a story from 1952 of a family that was just moving into public housing that said, "We feel like people again." Now, 40 or 50 years later, those same public housing communities are in the process of being raised. And I don't think there's anyone of good and sound mind who believes that we should not improve and impact on our housing for all people, and that new housing is certainly something that our city would want to have in the 21st century. The question and the problem with gentrification, however, is that people are removed from communities without given a place to go to. That is the problem. The problem is that in our city and all urban communities, it is not unique to Norfolk, and there is no attempt to bash Norfolk, because this is a common occurrence in cities across America. Cities are eliminating public housing and not replacing affordable housing. What that means for us in Norfolk is that there are 4,200 people, 4,200 people who live in 3 public housing communities that over the next decade will be eliminated. Beginning this year, approximately 200 of them will be moved before the end of the year. And people are given Section 8 vouchers. Now that sounds good. Take your Section 8 voucher and go find yourself someplace else to live. What's the problem with that?
Affordability.
Where, number one. Number two, your Section 8 voucher is not moving your community into a new place. And the people who will soon be your neighbors are not too happy about you moving next door. We are talking, when we talk about gentrification, we're talking about communities. Oftentimes, for people who look at public housing communities, you don't realize that the people who live within the gate, as the professor has so eloquently stated, people who live in the box, live in communities. They have recreational activities, they have family, they have friends, and suddenly, when that public housing community, or whatever it is eliminated, then they have to go to a new facility. My question is, what kind of city do we want in Norfolk? Do we want a city in Norfolk that has communities for people who have low income, as well as people who have middle and higher income? If that answer is yes, then it means that some of the federal dollars, because see, we're not just talking about race, we're talking about economic racism. Economic racism says that when you have an opportunity zone, which is what the federal government has, and what Dr. Ben Carson, who's our HUD secretary, came here and previewed our city. When you have federal funding coming in, that money is designed to support the people, not just for the new housing, but also for an opportunity for the people who are being displaced to have an affordable, comfortable, and secure environment called a community. And that isn't happening in most places. Perhaps the professors here may know of some, I don't. Gentrification, if it were to work, would have to allow for those who are displaced to have housing to go to, not just a bed, not just a neighborhood to go into, but to continue to live their lives. And do you know how you can tell when a neighborhood has been gentrified? All of a sudden you start seeing little flower shops, you start seeing little coffee houses, you start seeing little walk-through donut places. All of that is a part of community, building a community. Do you know who's living in those little areas with all these cute little flower shops and other things that make for community? It's not the people who are displaced because they can't afford to live there anymore. And when we as a city and as concerned people do not encourage our government to build affordable housing for people, not just black people, not just white people, but people who cannot afford to live in the upscale neighborhoods that are being replacing poor neighborhoods. I would hope that our city would take seriously the lives of 4,193 people who will lose what they call their home. It may not look like much to some of us who have never been in circumstances where we were forced because of economic conditions to live. But because we have been blessed not to have to live there, then our city and those who enforce the codes in the city to make sure that neighborhoods don't go down once people move into them from other communities, then we will begin to have a city that, when we saw in the video, the gentrification, the model city, it will be a city that cares about all people, not just the people who can afford to move into the neighborhoods that have been upscaled on government funding. Thank you.
Dr. Kim will share with us on this topic from his perspective as a geologist.
Geographer. First, thank you.
Geographer.
It's a hard act to follow. It's been really enlightening listening to you both speak. I have my crib notes. I hope you'll forgive me. I'm also a bit of an outsider. I'm from the other side of the water, as they say, from Newport News, and I've actually only been in this region of the country for 7 years. I am a geographer. I'm an urban and social geographer, and I'm particularly interested in human processes and urban processes that shape our cities. Because as I tell my students, every day. Nothing is kind of coincidental or random. Things are the way they are because they're put that way, oftentimes reflecting the forces of power and reflecting the interests of those who have the power to put them that way for a particular purpose. And I've been working on a project over the last 3 or 4 years on the durability of racial segregation in the country and in Hampton Roads in particular. And I think when you measure it statistically, it's quite shocking. The most American urban areas are as segregated, measuring it quantitatively, are as segregated today as they were in April of 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed, just over 51 years ago. And most urban areas today are more racially segregated than they were at the end of Reconstruction. And it begs kind of an obvious question of why. Why is racial segregation, why has racial segregation been so incredibly durable over the last 51 years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act that supposedly got rid of laws that forced racial segregation? And I think I only want to make kind of 2 or 3 broad global points about this, and then end very briefly with a kind of thought or 2 on the situation, the CNI and the redevelopment plan here in this area. And the first point that I try to go with is that racial segregation is produced. It's not accidental, it's not coincidental, it's not just purely a function of individual agency, of people individually deciding with their own free will where to live, birds of a feather flock together, this kind of thing. That's not why racial segregation exists. It is produced through governmental policies, it is produced through economic structures, it is produced through structural racism throughout our society that has lasted for hundreds of years. And it has very, very real consequences, as we saw in the video, especially with the production of what's called the racial wealth gap, the median net worth of white families compared to the median net worth of black families in the US. It is something that we all should be ashamed of, quite frankly. But it's not just wealth. Segregated neighborhoods beget segregated schools. And in most places, most jurisdictions in the US, schools are funded through local property taxes, and if property values are low, that translates into undervalued, segregated black neighborhoods, underfunding schools, thus reproducing racialized poverty. And so segregation is produced actively in the way that you saw in the video, and it has absolute real material consequences that continue into the present day, and frankly have very little sign of abating in the near and perhaps, hopefully not, but perhaps distant future. The second point I want to make is that while that is all, to me, kind of apparent, it seems apparent, the second thing is that the forces that produce racial segregation are actually kind of hard to uncover, hard to figure out what's going on. Part of it is because it happened, the laws that forced segregation happened a long time ago. So that map that you're looking at, this is the Homeowners Loan Corporation map from Norfolk. The data was collected in 1938 and 1939. The map was published in 1940, and it was buried in the National Archives and only digitized a couple of years ago. And by a team of sociologists somewhere. I actually don't know the original people who went to the archives and scanned that map. But what they have done is they've taken a forgotten history and they've scanned over 250 redlining maps from 250 different urban areas around the country. And so in a certain sense, our history is somehow, it's just hard to find. And perhaps kind of the flip side of that is because it happened so long ago, we assumed that that's not really why neighborhoods are segregated today. That was a long time ago. 1968, Fair Housing Act. It's done, that's old news. Now can we please move on? And the connection between past and present is oftentimes assumed to not be causal in some way. I have to look at my notes. And also, I think in the present day, the reason the forces that segregate our neighborhoods in the present day, that continually segregate our neighborhoods, it's just, they're complicated. It's hard to see, it's hard to understand. And what the result of this is, the result of the difficulty of understanding the actual forces, the social forces, economic forces, political forces, that result in racially segregated neighborhoods with real consequences. The result of that is that when we look around, we see what seems to be kind of weird and unfair and unequal and unjust, but we see it in San Francisco, we see it in Omaha, Nebraska, we see it in Newport News, we see it in Denver, Colorado, it's everywhere. We say, I guess that's just the way it is. There's a naturalizing force of these invisible processes that make the world that we inhabit seem to be just natural. I guess that's just the way it is. And I think my work, and I from what I'm hearing, I think the purpose of tonight, and the purpose of a lot of the work that's going on here, is to try to denaturalize this process and expose it for what it is. Deeply unequal social processes that privilege one group of people at the obvious, clear, and material expense of lots of other groups of people. I think that's, should I kind of climb off my high horse? And I'll make one kind of final kind of thought about the St. Paul's Quadrant and the C&I and the redevelopment going on here. Because I am an outsider, I don't live in Norfolk. I love Norfolk, I come to Norfolk frequently, but I'm not from here. I live in Newport News, and I'm a transplant from the desert southwest of New Mexico. I've been here for 7 years, and I plan on staying, but I'm a bit of an outsider, so I hesitate to get too specific coming into someone else's community. But what I will say is, I suppose Newport News is going through a kind of parallel process with the redevelopment of Marshall Ridley, and Ben Carson, when he was here, Secretary Carson, announced at the same time the grant for St. Paul's Quadrant as he did for the Marshall Ridley project in Newport News. There's kind of parallel forces going on. And I would call myself, and I was fiddling around all day today thinking of the term, how I feel about this. And I think I feel, and this is perhaps nonsensical, but pessimistically optimistic. And I'll explain very briefly, I'm going to turn off my microphone and sit back down. When I look at, in the case of Newport News, Marshall Ridley, I've been working with the African American Historical Society of Newport News, and they joke about, like, only in Newport News do they build segregated black housing projects on beachfront property. And here, when I look at this, it's from a geographical perspective, it's hard to not see the geographical location of these three HUD projects that are slated for demolition and renewal, just adjacent to, I suspect, what are some of the most commercially profitable real estate in the city. And in both cases, it makes me think that the interests of profit almost always win. We've seen this movie before. This is not a new script. At least the first half of the movie is not a new script. This happened in the 1940s with Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles. This happened in the 1950s and 60s in Southwest Washington, D.C. with the urban renewal project there. It happened in the 1990s and 2000s with the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. And I can think of lots of times where it went badly from the perspective of people the residents who are displaced. I can think of very, very, very few instances where it went well. And I think, hopefully, this is a script that still can be completed. But that's why I say I'm optimistic. But the historical legacy of these urban processes, I suppose, make me pessimistically optimistic. Yeah. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great information. Gentrification. What is it? I'll just say it in plain terms. Gentrification means to take back land. To take back land with the assumption that whoever has it, it does not belong to them. You talked about Dr. Perkins being in a cage, and the one safe place of power is home. When people are in a space where suddenly they're shifted with no decision of their own, they're being ripped away from their home. They've been ripped away from the place of belonging. There's nothing more human than to feel like you belong. There's something powerful about feeling as if I am where I'm supposed to be. This is where I belong. And then when suddenly your normalcy has been shifted by decisions that were made by someone else, let us imagine what that must feel like for the people who once called that place home. My grandfather, I started out with in Warm Springs, Georgia. He borrowed money from my maternal grandmother's mother's mother, so from maternal great-grandmother, who sold moonshine. She must have been Presbyterian right there. He was in his 80s when he died, and I remember in his 70s, I tried to get Granddaddy to get a new house, and he said, God gave me this hut, and I'm going to keep my hut. That was a profound statement, partly because it really was a hut. But grandfather grew up at a time where he just needed somewhere to belong. And although times had changed, he still had a sense that the world had moved on, and if he moves away from the place that was his own, that something will happen to his manhood. So he'd rather stay in his impoverished situation, although he could have, by his grandchildren and his children, moved out to a better place. But he could not wrap his brain around moving from a place that he called home, because he lived in a world that nowhere was home but the hut that his mother-in-law helped him buy.
That's it.
There's something psychologically traumatizing by living in a location where you feel like you don't belong, because people are making decisions about whether you stay or whether you go. And then when people are sent away to fend for themselves, and then they are put in a situation as nomads in a land with no place called home. All over the country. This is not just here, this is all over the country. All over the world in many places, in many ways, but specifically all over the country. People are just sitting out, and the places that used to be called the ghetto and the inner cities are no longer the ghettos. They're now becoming the place that has been ripped away from the people who once called that home, and they've been sent out to the suburbs, where the suburbs are now being ghettoized because the resources are going to the inner city where the prices are going up. So then people are living in trauma that has not been accentuated enough. It's quite interesting. The 90s and 80s, the war on drugs. Take these black and brown people who are on drugs and put them in jail. All of a sudden, when white people have an addiction, it's a psychological or mental health crisis. You know, the guns in Chicago and other places where these gang members are shooting up people, throw these thugs away, and then all of a sudden when the spotlight comes on young white men who are going around and doing these massacres, they have a mental health crisis. I mean, I can't make this stuff up. I'm just saying. Can you imagine what it's like to live with cinder blocks as your wall? Even though it's your place called home, don't you think that impoverished situations lend to psychological trauma?
Come on.
And could it be that more people are living in a way where they're just surviving because they're unable to thrive in a world that has passed them by, and now we make a decision to send them from that place called home? What kind of world are we creating? Lastly, I wonder, bringing it home to Norfolk, I wonder, a city that is nearly 50-50 black and white, what would now we call it redevelopment project, but I think that needs to be unpacked a bit more to make sure that it's nothing similar to this word called gentrification, because gentrification tends to shift demographics. Question is, in 20 years, will Norfolk be 50-50 black and white? Or would we have pushed all the black people out to fend for themselves in places where there are no resources? Now, we have questions.
We do. So, obviously, this is an important discussion, and there's a lot of questions, as you can see by the stack of cards that I have here. We obviously won't be able to get to all of them. Come grab that. And a lot of them are redundant, so there's a few I want to start out with that have been asked multiple times that I think are kind of trending here. You kind of addressed this a minute ago, and I'm going to make it a two-part question, but why should the people in the St. Paul's area think that the current gentrification in their area will have a different outcome from the past gentrification? And I think as a piggyback to that, what are some research-informed solutions to the issue of gentrification, or are there examples that you can cite of responsible gentrification? And if so, what attributes and how are they achieved? And how might we engage in those processes? So that's a big question, but I figured you guys could break that down a little bit.
Ms. Andrews, how is this project going to reap different outcomes than other projects of gentrification?
I don't see where it will unless there is put in place the element of affordable housing that I mentioned, and that people who are being displaced, and particularly think about some of those elderly people who really don't have anywhere else to go. So unless there is affordable housing that is made available on a larger scale than what is currently available. I believe the rental stock is very, very slight here in Norfolk. So there's no place for people to go. I don't see it being any different. This city has a history of this kind of activity. Ocean View. Have you been to Ocean View lately? Those of you who, I didn't grow up here, but when I came here, everything had been pretty much cleared out. But if you go down there now, it is absolutely gorgeous in some parts. Of course, there's Kent, Broad Creek, which is a black area over there off of Princess Anne Road and Virginia Beach Boulevard, that area that was built after Bowling Park and Roberts Park were torn down. I don't see any evidence that this project will be any different.
Perkins, that's the policy.
I do. To answer the question, it's not. I have not heard anything, I have not seen anything, and nothing is in writing to prove anything different. It's interesting that you wrote up Broad Creek, because when I first came back to Norfolk, they were in the midst of these plans. And I brought some city officials to my class, the urban studies class, to talk about it. And I brought up the same questions that are being asked or just been asked in the same conversations. And I used the term dislocated people. And they jumped all over me. We're not dislocating people. We're going to give them training and education, and we're going to build mixed income communities and bring them back. Where are they? I have yet to see them back yet. And what some cities have done, for example, San Francisco, is that they gentrify, build up these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful condominiums, and said we're going to bring a percentage of those that live there back. So for every 400 units, they will bring one family back. And so when the question is asked, by the way, I don't know who provided that question, but it's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why there's so much misunderstanding and contempt about the process. So when it all comes down to it, the people that are being displaced are not invited back. But they're not going to say to them, you can't come back. What they're going to say is, well, the rent is is now, unfortunately, you can't afford it. So it's not racial segregation, it's an economic issue. But in practice, it's what? Racial segregation, and it's dislocating people. Now, why I think that it's not going to be different? Because they didn't tell us it was going to be any different. They don't have a plan for it to be any different. So I would be dumb as a rock to think that it's going to be different.
Is my mic on? Yes. I think I can kind of talk in a less specific way about the second part of the question, which is perhaps the more theoretical, abstract part of the question, which is how could it be different? And what occurs to me is that the federal government spent the better part of the 20th century subsidizing the building of wealth for white families through housing policies, either subsidizing developers that then were able to sell at a discount houses to white would-be home buyers, or directly subsidizing, especially through discounted interest rates, directly to individual white home buyers. And there was, many, many decades of the 20th century were spent with lots of money from the federal government and from state and city government subsidizing the accumulation, of white wealth. And it occurs to me that this is an opportunity to do the same in an overtly justice-oriented way, to build the wealth of people of color, not through discounted rental opportunities, but actually through a very real investment in actually creating wealth for black families through housing. Because in the middle 50% of net worth in the US, the overwhelming majority, as you saw in the video, is in the one single house that a family owns and lives in. It's not through your second house and your beach house and your investment properties. The overwhelming majority of family wealth in the US is in the one house that you own and live in. And this seems like an opportunity, and in the past, they seemed like opportunity lost after opportunity lost after opportunity lost to actually invest in the generation and accumulation of wealth for families of color. And I'll end.
Challenging is we don't necessarily have an expert here today from the Housing Authority to speak on the actual St. Paul's quadrant, which was the original intention, because there are some specific questions. There are some specific questions about the actual project and what's going on in the actual, because there's a lot of people who have questions about what exactly is the plan for the St. Paul's quadrant, and about the vouchers that are being offered to the residents and where are the displaced people going to go. And I don't know if you, in this forum, if we have the ability to answer those questions, but if you want to speak on that for a minute.
Yeah, I can answer a little bit of that. The displaced people will be given vouchers, Section 8 vouchers, that will allow them to find housing where they can, which means there has to be a landlord who will accept the Section 8 housing. And of course, it has to be within a certain amount of money for that person to move there. There is and I don't know, and NRAJ would have to answer that question. I don't know what the percentage, there is an allowance for a certain number of people to cut 90% of what?
It's a 90% housing rental rate. So what the voucher does is, what they planning to do is raise that maximum rate so that you can afford either the highest or the lowest, and put you somewhere in between that. So it's a percentage that has like a range. Okay. Right now they're at the 9%. If they go any more than 100, then they have to get special permission from the government to do that.
Right.
So,
So that would be the voucher you're talking about.
Yes.
There's a certain percentage that will be encouraged to move back into the redesigned, redeveloped area. And I don't know what that number is, but it's very small, but at the same time, there are tax credits that are offered to the developers that allow for that to happen. Now, those tax credits expire at a certain time. It just depends on whatever the arrangement is between the city and the developer. I don't know when that would expire. Once it expires, then the developer or the unit, the housing unit, is no longer required to allow that same rate for that individual who's living in that new redeveloped area, which means, say that person is paying, let's just say $1,000. And once the tax credit leaves, that rent could go up to $2,000. Well, obviously, if the person's no longer getting that subsidy, even with the voucher that allows the person to live there for a while, that person will have to move, so you've got another displacement. There's no plan in place for the displaced. City Councilman Paul Riddick has been advocating at City Council and with his colleagues to put something in place for the displaced people who will be, the 4,000 people who will be moving out of the area that's going to be redeveloped. So the answer is, unless it's under wraps, there is no plan.
Next question?
So, it's back on the St. Paul's corridor area, is there anything, what are they getting right? And are there anything areas, you kind of spoke to this a little bit, that they can focus on more? If you could be kind of king, queen for the day, what would be the, the kind of one point that you think that they could really focus on a little bit more that we could learn from your expertise on that?
Perkins?
I'm king for a day. That's better than having an open mic. Well, we're talking about community and the problems that arise out of those that are directly impacted in terms of their safe haven. But if we look at it from a broader perspective, we have to understand that capitalism is at play.
That's right.
And capitalism is a monster. But you cannot have a democracy without having capitalism. And unearthed is the true fact that in a democracy, in a capitalist society, you have to have a whole lot of poor people to have a few rich people. That's the ugly fact. And that's the thing that people really don't want to acknowledge. So, I'm king for a day. If I was king for a day, I would make sure that...
Tell it.
Well, I was going to talk about reparations, I'll get away from it.
Tell it.
Y'all have another class, I'll come back. If I was king for a day outside of my previous comment, I would make sure that access was possible for all human beings.
Amen.
I think safe haven, home, and community is a human right. And I also think that it should be protected just like we protect all of our other inalienable rights. I don't care what your income is. In this great land that we call America, we can figure this out.
Thank you.
And this great land where we have so much free space and land
That's right.
and opportunities, we can figure this out. And this great experiment that we call America, this tossed salad bowl of different people with different ingredients, with all kinds of culture and races and understanding and ethnicity and languages, we can figure this out. So the fact that we allow 1% of our population
To dictate.
dictate to us who's going to have a home and where they're going to have a home is problematic. So as king of the day, the 1% of the population get to live in low-income housing.
You won't be invited back.
We'll be sitting high on a hog.
All right.
All right.
Wait a minute.
You queen for a day?
All right, Queen.
I, as queen for a day, would be with his family, right next door, enjoying a part of the wealth that this country certainly has. And I think, as he said, in all seriousness, it's all about vision. It's all about leadership. It's all about deciding what kind of people do we want to be. Do we want to be a people who look at the them and look at the us? Or do we want to be a people who believe that there are people who want the same thing that other people who have want? I think everybody wants a decent, clean place to live. I think everybody wants their children to have an education that allows them to become law-abiding citizens. Now, whether it happens or not is another matter, and I certainly believe that not everybody takes advantage of opportunities to live that kind of life, and that's why we have issues and problems. But at least the opportunity should be there for that to happen. And if I were queen for a day, the opportunity would be there.
All right. Well, I'll stop short of being king for a day, but and I suppose, Dr. Perkins, I'm somewhat less. I'm somewhat more skeptical of the idea that capitalism is a necessary ingredient for a well-functioning democracy. But it's what we have, and it's what we're going to have for who knows how long, and it's the system that we operate within. As I said in my opening remarks, the interests of the profit interests of capital almost always trump the very, very, very thin power of marginalized groups of people. And I think that one thing that in a concrete and real sense is very strong at a city level and at a state level, really strong regulations to make sure that some of the power is transferred to the interests of marginalized groups of people compared with the profit-seeking interests of capital. For example, it was a quick point in the video. Virginia is home to 5 of the top 10 most evicting municipalities in the entire country. Hampton Roads is home to 4 of the top 10 most evicting municipalities in the entire country. Newport News, Hampton, Norfolk, and Chesapeake all make the top 10 list. That's because, one, as a New York politician who I can't remember his name says, the rent is too damn high. And two, the mechanisms, it's just too easy to evict people. It's too easy to evict people, and once somebody is evicted, it's that as a recent investigative report said, that Scarlet E follows them around and makes it so incredibly difficult to ever rent anywhere other than some of the worst kind of slumlord housing there is. And so there are very real, concrete protections that can be given to renters and to essentially lower the rents and protect people from profiteering in the rental industry.
A few more questions.
relate to the St. Paul's quadrant, to this particular area. But one thing that I think is an overlying issue that kind of keeps coming up that I think is important is how can we start, or in this case, continue the open and honest discussion about race in Norfolk within this community?
All right.
I like that question because I do truly believe that conversation and discourse and dialogue are key to people getting to understand and value each other. And learning how other people think, I think is the first step toward valuing other people who are not like you are, like I am, like we are. So I think that the Journaling Guide has a vision of such town hall meetings as we see here. I think that the Urban Renewal Center has certainly demonstrated this evening that it has a vision of people getting together in settings such as we see here to share and to begin to unlock some of the myths and stereotypes that we have about who we are and who they are. And so I would hope that that this center, this church, and I applaud the church also, because this is where we get our direction as we live as people, those of us who consider ourselves Christians, as people of God, learning how to be brothers and sisters to each other. Amen.
This is such an intimate group. These questions are just awesome. I actually had this very same question when I was invited to be a part of a panel at Old Dominion University. I answered it, and they haven't invited me back. so I'm debating whether or not you don't want to hear my response to it.
Tell it.
Well, and where's Jim Wood? Pastor. Okay, Pastor, you pray for me. All right. My response is, and I'm just going to be completely transparent, because I believe in truth. And I always say, if the truth hurts, it's supposed to, because that pushes us to change. I think that the colleges and universities and high schools in the area, all of them, need to design a course. And that course should be entitled N-Word 101. If you really want to get to the bottom of all this racial stuff, you cannot without dealing with that word. Amen. And I'm not talking about the sound of the word or the letters that come together to make the word. I'm talking about the social context of that word. There is no other word more powerful in the English language than that word. That word has started wars. That word has broken up families. That word has broken down communities. That word, by the mere utterance in the wrong place at the wrong time, can get you killed. So if we really want to deal with race, we have to deal with that word. And not, again, not the sound, because we get triggered by the sound, but it's what it symbolizes. When people hear it, the images it conjures up, the anger, the deep-rooted discontent that it garners up, the hatred that spews out, all wrapped around a social construction that we call race. That word is what we need to deal with.
You have any more questions for us?
So I think what Harris is that so many of the questions are focused in very specifics on St. Paul's, and we definitely want to do this again where we can engage in those specific conversations, have folks here that can work with us with answering questions, and I think that would be great. Having said that, this has been absolutely phenomenal. Absolutely. You have been a rich gift for us, but what has made it phenomenal is look around this room and tell me there's not an interest from people of all different backgrounds, races, experiences. There's an interest in this. And that makes me so proud of the city in which I live and the city that I love. And I believe that it's a call for us to seek to be a city on the hill. Amen? So we're going to go to church in a minute. So one of the things we want to do is to, so many folks have said, so what? So what? So what? So we want to put out a few so whats. In no way is this an indication that our city leaders have not considered these things, that they're not working on them. This is not that there's a void in leadership. That is not at all our point. But what we're looking and saying is what can we, as a collective citizenry, what is it that where we can be involved, and how is it that we can be engaged? And so where from here, right? So where? Next. Where? Pray! And I mean this. And I mean it in a sense for all of us, depending on our experience. There are places in my life where I need to be on my knees in repentance. Repentance for my personal actions, and repentance for the system in which I live that so privileges me. And I recognize that, and I understand that, and I so desire and should desire that be something that is not only available, but something that's empowering for all of us in our city and in our nation. We all know that. So let's be a people of prayer. But what else in the midst of that? We got to become aware of where here is. If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. You'll see on these tables back here, we only got a few people coming tonight. So we made some copies of some articles that are national and that are city-based. We've got a number of book selections up there that we would encourage you to read. Dr. Newby Alexander has an amazing text on what happened in Norfolk in the middle part of the 20th century. There's a great book called Black, White, and Brown. It looks at Brown and the Board of Education and what happened in our city and how we ended up with these disparities. So we need to know our history. And particularly, and I'm speaking to a lot of white folks here, we need to understand how we ended up where we are, right? And being able to recognize that. We need to relearn and engage. Order the new journaling guide, right? Yes. Absolutely. It is the third oldest continually published African American publication in the United States. I subscribe to it, and I find it to be very helpful for me to engage in conversation, and just it's helpful for me. Look at livingapart.com. This is what Dr. Finn has put together, and he's looking at mapping in some really amazing ways, not just in Hampton Roads, but really looking at disparities, food disparities, all kinds of different ways for it. Look at that. We've been so impressed with it. And listen to others' experiences. So what's next after that? We got to raise the bar. I get this from my dear friend Barbara Hamley, building authentic relationships. And one of the things that's incumbent on all of us is to design, develop, and implement what the sociologists call third place experiences. First place our home, second place where we work. Where's the third place?
Right here.
That bridge existing lines of separation. Right? I've been invited to preach at Sarah Baptist on September the 15th. And Dr. Jones' invitation means more to me than you can ever imagine. But how is it that we bridge these, that we create third spaces similar to this, but not just in Ghent, right? But where we would go to the hunt and Y as whites, where we would be engaged, so that we create these third places where we can be in a relationship together. Amen? Amen. Okay, keep going. Community-based Commission on Housing and Education Disparities. It is not the sole responsibility of our city government to solve our issues. It is something, amen? Right? I mean, it is for us to be able to look at these housing and education disparities. The public school system that is designed in Norfolk today where the placement of the schools are, was designed in the 1950s to maintain segregation. When they knew that they were no longer going to be able to do it by law, they were going to do it by fact. That's not it. I'm not trying to throw shade on it. I'm just saying that's the reality. We need to be a people who are looking at this and recognizing that the housing and the education disparities are intimately connected. And so what does that look like? Forums. I go back, I'm still on a roll on this one. Learning materials. And we need, as the citizens, to develop dashboards of accountability for us, tracking what I call resettlement. Right? And it's not movement, it's resettlement implications. Racial composition. Dr. Harris mentioned that earlier. The shift in housing disparities, the eviction rates, those types of things I think are critical for us. And with goals that we set as the citizens to say this is what we desire for our city. So keep going. The next thing is to incentivize mixed income neighborhoods beyond St. Paul's with specific targets through private and public partnership. I believe that people first is well intentioned. That's not the point. You can prepare people as much as you can, but if nobody's going to receive them, where are they going to go? How are we going to be a people that create the segregation that we have within our communities by neighborhoods? And because we've got so much water and we've got small neighborhoods, this is the easiest city probably in America to keep segregated, whether it's intentional or not. So how do we incentivize these mixed incomes? Very much what Dr. Finn was saying. Okay. Establish a community-based commission on minority home ownership initiatives. If we provide, it was interesting to me, the Wall Street Journal had an article 3 or 4 weeks ago that was just going on and on about the great crisis that was coming because these white millennials are not buying homes. And they don't know what's going to happen with the economy, all of this. Well, we've got generations of African Americans who've not been able to own a home. So how is it that we can not just find housing? Because if we move from one rental to another rental to another rental, no one is, if my mom and dad had done that, we'd have never had the accumulated wealth, just a few $1,000s to help the end of life for my mom, right? So how is it that we can move beyond just where's the rental, where are the vouchers, but what is it that looks for minority home ownership initiatives that are dispersed throughout our city? The next one is to advocate for legislation that addresses who accepts Section 8 vouchers. There are several cities in the United States that have passed legislation within the city that have required landowners, landlords who own more than several pieces of rental property to be open to accepting them. As I understand it now, if you don't want to take a voucher, you don't have to. We need to look at that. And then we need to have financial incentives for residents and landlords moving together. How is it that we can, there are several cities as well that are providing extra funding that bump those vouchers to enable people to get into home neighborhoods that they wouldn't be able to get in without those vouchers. That's being done. Let's look at that. How do we look at these segregated neighborhoods? The tenant law advocacy, this whole understanding of eviction is the issue of how easy it is because of the instability. So how do we look at that? And then absolutely, and I know we know the codes of it, but how is our city, and this is on our government, this is on our administration, how is our city going to enforce the codes for privately held rental properties? Because at least if you're in the quadrant now, you know who your landlord is, it's the federal government. When you're moving, who is it? And what is it with lead paint and poisoning that is one of the primary causes of health issues for children in our country, safe living conditions, those types of things. These are the kinds of things that we think can be done. They're not pie in the sky things. I don't think you have to be a king or a queen for a day to get this, right? And then the last one, pray, right? I mean, how is it that we as a people, as the citizens of this great city, are able to be bound and united together? So I just want to pause for a moment before we pray. And I'm going to ask Dr. Harris, because she pray a lot better than me. I'm Presbyterian, I'm boring. I want you to just look around the room and see the different folks that are here. I'm very serious about that right now. Look at the diversity and look at the interest that's here. This is Norfolk. And this is what we can do when we care and when we're concerned and when we come together. Not to throw shade, but to bring light. Amen? Okay, so Oh, so please invite everyone to the St. Paul's Advisory Committee meeting on the third Tuesday at 6 o'clock. It's at St. Mary's Church. Father Jim Kern, one of our dear friends as well. So on the St. Paul's Advisory Committee on the third Tuesday at 6 o'clock at St. Mary's Church. We want to give you some information for this as well. The video that you saw at the beginning, the text is back here. There's limited copies of that. It is available on the Urban Renewal Center website now. So if you want to look at it, you want to share it with anyone, we'd love for you to do that. The bibliography that goes with that to show that we're giving you facts, we're not giving you stuff, is presented as well. The Urban Renewal website will have a lot of resources. There's a lot of materials that are back here, both national and local. Councilman Riddick, there's an article from you back there. So we're grateful for all the different types of things that have come together for this. So we want to encourage you. This has been recorded. It's live streamed now. It will be available within the next day or so. We will get that for you. There are cards on the table. We would love for you, before we go, and I promise you, I looked out. You don't want to go outside right now anyway. So you heard the thunder earlier. We would love for you to take that card, put your contact information on it. This is not for the Urban Renewal Center. This is for our city, right? I mean, put your name on it, and what is it that you feel? How is it that you feel the movement of something for us in the future? Ideas, thoughts, where you want to be engaged on that. And give us that contact information so we can share all these other things with you. That's our obligation to you for being here tonight and for being so patient with us. So please do that and consider it before you go. And I would encourage you, before you leave, meet someone that you don't think might be quite like you. And I don't think I need to say any more than that. Just let's do that. And let's be the not only the people of God, but let's be the people of this great city. Okay? Dr. Harris.
Jim, I would be remiss if I didn't say, this is why we created the Urban Renewal Center.
Amen.
Amen.
And special thanks to Alex Fella, who put the entire video together for us. But we feel like it really helps us frame the conversation to understand at least where here is now. And then let us dream where here will be tomorrow. So, okay.
All right. Let's pray together. Father, in Jesus' name, we thank you for tonight. We thank you for precious people who have come together because they are concerned and they want to see the city be the best that it can be. And I thank you, dear Lord, for the conversation that we've had tonight. I ask you, Lord, that although we're unable to answer all the questions because we don't have all the answers, we know, Almighty God, you do. You can deposit into our imagination a way forward that eyes have not seen nor ears have heard, neither has it entered into the heart of humankind what you have in store for this city. And I pray, dear Lord, as we leave this place without your presence tonight, that you will turn within us a prophetic imagination, an imagination that imagines a world as you intend for it to be. And I pray, God, that you would give us the wisdom of knowing what part we have to play in building a city that reflects your glory, overcoming the challenges of our past, carving out a new terrain for the future, helping us to be a city on a hill that cannot be hidden from the world, a nation that is in desperate need of leadership. Teach us what it means to model, what it means to be racially diverse and ethnically diverse and affirming of gender differences and religious differences, and help us to know what it means to love each other because we are human people and we have the human decency to care for people who are in difficult situations. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.